welcome to everyone who is here. And I would like to start the discussion with Professor Trosper in regards to how does he view the importance of indigenous economics for our context in the United States when we think about how a lot of the people, as part of the leadership of the Ecozoic, we think about how can we reform higher education so we can actually reconnect, especially Western educated folks, with the rest of nature. And I just would like to have your take on how you've been doing that for your entire career, and in that context of your new book. So go ahead.
All right. So your question is a little bit more elaborate than the one I prepared to answer, but I think my answer relates to that. And that's that indigenous economics, my career has been teaching in economics departments, forestry departments, American Indian Studies. And my understanding of indigenous economics is that it relies on two central ideas. First, strong relationships are the basis of good economics. And second, non-humans can participate in relationships. And those two ideas together really challenge the division of knowledge in universities. So that I ended up teaching in natural sciences departments, in American Indian Studies departments. I didn't make it in economics departments for reasons that should be clear. I got tired of arguing with them. But so economic studies exchange, usually assumed to be non-personal. Political science studies relationships. Sociology also studies relationships. And so those are the field of indigenous economics crosses those social science fields. Then when you add in the assumption that non-humans can participate in relationships, you end up crossing the line between the social sciences and the natural sciences. And so indigenous economics exists in a world of indigenous thinking, and that's why I ended up teaching in a course in a class in a department of American Indian Studies or First Nation Studies or whatever you want to use it, Indigenous Studies. So that's my main point, is that if you want to study indigenous economics, you end up crossing the boundaries of standard fields. And one of the persons that I really utilize a lot in my book, in addition to the sociologist Margaret Archer, is the political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who got a Nobel Prize in economics, which occurred because she's provided a political answer to an economic question. How do you manage a commons sustainably? So Lynn Ostrom illustrates the way that indigenous economics crosses disciplines. So what's the consequence of that is that if you end up studying indigenous economics, you end up studying relational relationships, and that's how I understand it.
Oh, thank you so much for that answer. It helps us to understand very much how indigenous economics tries to create better relationships between humans and the rest of nature. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on the aspect of how do we manage common pool resources. I think most people, especially students of environmental science studies, have read about Harding's tragedy of the commons, and I would like you to discuss more about how Ostrom and your work has shown that there are better ways to manage beyond just privatization and the same old ways of trying to protect resources that sometimes doesn't even work. Go ahead.
Well, that's a slightly the tragedy of the commons, in my view, has a colonial basis. It arises out of the idea that humans can independently, without cooperating among themselves, extract resources from a commons. They can harvest fish, they can harvest deer, they can harvest water, And this idea of individualism, individuals acting without cooperation, creates the tragedy of the commons. And Ostrom herself, in her book Governing the Commons, points out that the tragedy is caused by separating people out and making them individualistic. And so that's the first connection I see, is that if you want to deal with commons problems, you have to reestablish relationships among the humans. And then to make another step, you have to include relationships among the non-humans. And very often people don't understand, how do you, if non-humans are participating in relationships, do they communicate with us? What do they do? And my view is the humans need to understand the needs of non-humans and what they would say if they could say what they want to do. For instance, with fish. How do fish reproduce? Well, typically the oldest fish are the most productive. And so you have to have old fish in order to have fish reproduce. And so the indigenous people realize when they manage fish is you have to support the fish that reproduce. And those are often the oldest fish. So Fekrit Berkus discovered that in northern Canada, in lakes, indigenous peoples fished across the age spectrum. They fished all ages. They didn't just fish the oldest fish. If you fish the oldest fish, you end up having a population crash. Another example is the argument about how to manage animals such as sheep or elk, where the oldest ones are the most important. Excuse me, I'm glad I didn't have to travel to Vermont. I'm kind of cold, and that would have made traveling difficult. And of course, there aren't any aircraft controllers anymore. So another point about managing the commons is understanding how the fish, the deer, the beaver all operate. And indigenous peoples studied the non-indigenous members of their communities and figured out what they needed and then dealt with them that way. For instance, in managing beaver, they recognized that beaver are density dependent, and if you let beaver overpopulate, they'll stop reproducing. So you need to keep their numbers in an area where they will reproduce, and you can harvest the beaver, and the beaver will live well together. Another example is that the Three Sisters story of plants, where corn, beans, and squash all to get together because they each protect the other and they each provide things to each other. So the idea that relationships govern nature extends from the fact that relationships govern humans. And so that's why I think that answers your question. How is it that indigenous economics deals with the tragedy of the commons, recognizes the tragedy of the commons comes from lack of cooperation and lack of recognition of the role of non-humans? If you include both of those things, you will manage the commons well.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. I would like to ask you about, when people hear the word relationality or how to become more relational, especially non-indigenous people, right, who have been taught to be more individualistic, and the whole higher education system is about separating humans from each other and from the rest of nature. So yes. How can we reconnect to the rest of nature?
So that's tricky. When I I think it's a matter of building relationships among humans and insisting on the relationality of nature. And the way I did it in my class in Traditional Ecological Knowledge at the University of Arizona is I used collaborative teaching techniques. University of Arizona, very fortunately for me, created a whole set of collaborative classrooms where each room had tables where 4 people could sit at the table and have a discussion. So I would organize my class asking the students to discuss key questions in ecological economics and report back to the whole group. And so we would reproduce relationships in the classroom. And that's my way of emphasizing relationships. When I would be invited to lecture in a large lecture hall, I would use a method of getting people sitting next to each other to talk to each other. You have them talk to each other on a question, then come up with an answer, and then answer it in the group. So you break up, rather than lecturing the whole time, you ask people to talk to the people next to them and establish two-person groups as a way of learning relationality, so that I would teach relational principles in my guest lecturing and in my traditional ecological knowledge class. And when I taught ecological economics, or rather indigenous economics, I did it the same way with a collaborative classroom. And I noticed that the classroom you're in could be changed into a collaborative classroom because the chairs are movable. And you can form people into small groups, and they can discuss questions among themselves and then learn together. So my answer is introduce relationality into the classroom, and then people will get a sense of what it means.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's tricky, right? You're basically asking people to overcome the individualistic instinct, not instinct, but like cultural imposition that has been placed on everyone. But you mentioned ecological economics. You know, we teach ecological economics, UVM. Josh Farley's actually sitting right in front of me here. UVM is known to be a hub for ecological economics, and the way I study ecological economics myself, that's why I came here. And I see ecological economics as almost like a Western approach to try to reconnect humans with the rest of nature. Fundamentally, that's how I see it. But still, there are issues with it, and I would like to have your thoughts on that, or how you have been able to navigate the lack of, I don't know, moving beyond just West, because it is founded on natural sciences, which itself is not very relational. But how have you navigated the ecological economic space and the connection with indigenous economics?
So whenever I teach economics, say in a school of forestry or so forth, I teach it in terms of relationships and the importance of building relationships among humans and with humans and non-humans. So I tend to take on directly the role of individualism in economics in generating the problems of tragedy of the commons. That economics, and in fact, one could use the example of Lynn Ostrom. She got a Nobel Prize in economics, but she's not had a big influence in the field of economics. She's had a much bigger influence in the field of law, because the lawyers were interested in her analysis, and the lawyers were more open to political aspects than the economists were. Economists are very uncomfortable with the notion of building models that emphasize relationships rather than individualism. So one has to just take on the individualism point directly, in my view. And also, it's very helpful, the growing literature now, and I, in preparing for this presentation, I checked on the citations of an article by Harold Eister and Terry Satterfield and Kai Chan from the University of British Columbia, where they cite examples of relationality in natural science and say, look, if you look at relationality, you can understand ecological systems better. And they give credit to indigenous thinkers as the folks that have said, include relationships in your study of ecology. And they cite me and they cite other indigenous thinkers and say, look, if you include indigenous thought in your work, you'll have people that understand relationality. And so I just found an article that by searching for people that cite the Eister-Satterfield, the Eister-Satterfield article is in, it's in People and Nature, which is publication of the British Ecological Society. It was published in 2023. The citations, there's an interesting article there citing the problem of protected areas and how do you get relational thinking into conservation of protected areas. And I was quite pleased to discover that this discussion of protected areas had lots and lots of references to what Indigenous people say about how to run protected areas. And so part of it is listen to Indigenous people, include Indigenous people in the decision making, and in that way learn how to include relationality in the analysis.
Well, it's great to know that more of this has been taken up to do better management, especially since Indigenous people have been displaced, colonized, and ignored for centuries now. So it's good to know that they have known better how to understand their ecosystems, because as you know, they see themselves as part of the ecosystem they live in, and it's our challenge to see ourselves as such as well. And there is this the growing movement of degrowth, right? I have a question here about degrowth that I was asked to ask. And I think you have thought about this in relation to how Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people, especially the aspect of reciprocity that you have written about. And then this also makes me think about Robin Kimmerer, who I went to undergraduate SUNY ESF, and I met her, and she just published her Serviceberry book, and it's related very much to your work. And I would like you just to talk a little bit more about reciprocity and how can that help us in a transition to less consumption or degrowth for the economy.
Yes, well, when Robin Kimmerer, I really like her book on braiding sweetgrass and her other books, but she really emphasizes reciprocity and learning to share with nature, learning to pay attention to what nature needs. And she advocates gardening as a wonderful way to learn how to do that. So the degrowth field, I feel, like ecological economics, it needs to be more looking at how people can be persuaded to deal with the problems that they create. And how can people be persuaded to listen to each other and to cooperate in coming up with solutions to the current problems? So I think I'm wandering a little bit from your question. Could you state it again?
No, it's fine. I would just try to get you to talk a little bit more about reciprocity. I think you got it. You got the answer that.
Well, let me say one more thing about reciprocity. When I started to write this book, I emphasized sharing and reciprocity as a way to deal with the problems of overusing nature. And the reviewers of the book said, well, you're talking about principles, but how is reciprocity a principle? And as I was thinking about it, I realized, well, I can't really start with reciprocity. I have to start with relationships. I have to go back to what the elders in many communities, including my own, say, which is focus on relationships, and then you can figure out what the answers are to your problems. And I got a bang out of, for instance, I listened a lot to the elders of the Pikangikum Nation in Ontario, and the Pikangikum folks have published their thinking and talked with others who have worked with them. And one of their arguments, they said, how can you tell a moose where to live? They were objecting to maps that said, well, this is the moose living area, this is the human living area. How do you divide up our forest to where the moose live? And they said, how do you tell the moose where to live? You have to figure out where they want to live and adjust to that. So that was a way of saying, include the moose and how they think in your analysis of the forest. Don't assume that by management you can tell the moose what to do. You just have to know what the moose want to do and adjust your analysis to that. And so that's an example, I think, of how including relationality in your analysis, say, of forest management makes sense.
Well,
The
thank
very
you.
words, some of the very words we use, like management and resources, all embody this separation of humans and nature that we need to reject.
Yeah, I think most of us agree with you, and I would like to open some time for Q&A from the audience. If anyone has any present, you have a question, raise your hand and speak up.
I was reading an article in the journal Science recently where they talked about having groups, open groups, links, listservs, et cetera. And they modeled they created a model, these researchers, hoping to understand why extremist views emerged in these groups. And they hope to be able to just kind of eliminate all sources of this and see that, in fact, actually, these listservs could become harmonious. But in fact, they kept finding that extremist views emerged over and over again. When you're working in a commons environment that's open to the society, how do you manage extremism?
One of the ways is to make sure that everybody has a chance to talk. I find that, that's why I like to break my classrooms into groups, is if everyone has a chance to talk and express themselves, the folks that are screaming and making the extremist arguments have to justify what they're saying to everybody else. They're forced to listen. And one of the things online is, when you're in an online group, where are you forced to listen to other people? It seems to me that the idea that a good group, a functioning group, listens to everybody in the group. They often make decisions by consensus, not by majority vote. And so very often the decision-making process and the interaction process online allows just a few voices to speak up. And so they dominate the discussion. So that's kind of my understanding of what goes on online. And in a classroom, from a teacher's point of view, if you try to get the class to speak up, only a few people will speak up. I suppose you guys have noticed that in a large group, you end up with a few group people dominating the discussion. So as a teacher, you need to come up with ways to let everybody talk. And having a stick that you can only speak if you're holding on to the stick. So if you've got the stick, you can speak. If you don't have it, you can't speak, and just pass the stick around. And this gives everybody a chance to speak, gives everybody a chance to participate, and this opens up the discussion and makes the extremist views harder to defend.
Thank you so much for that answer. Any more questions? Josh?
I mean, just, we always talk, tragedy of the commons is considered an example of a social dilemma. And, social dilemmas being where people acting in their own self-interest undermine the welfare of the whole. Do you think it'd be more appropriate to call those asocial dilemmas? That if we actually have good working society, those dilemmas don't appear because people naturally will cooperate and coordinate?
So is your question, are people willing to cooperate, and that's how you get rid of these social dilemmas?
Or is the idea that a social dilemma is actually created by the atomization of people into individuals? Correct. And that if you actually have a well-working society, it's not a dilemma.
That's right. You have to look at the atomization principles, look at the reasons that people can't cooperate, and address those. Yes, so the social dilemmas come from an inability to cooperate. The inability to cooperate comes from a variety of places, many of which stem from individualism, an insistence that decisions are going to be made by majority vote. And so you need consensus as a better decision-making process. So that's my answer generally is, in fact, there's an interesting movement in terms of planning for forests, planning for groups, where governance by consensus is emphasized rather than governance by majority vote. And that's part of it. That's why in my book I stress the rules that Ostrom came up with, the principles that she came up with, some of those principles are principles that help people work together. Others are the relational goods that are created when people are able to work together. And so that's why in the book I've emphasized relational leadership, relationship building, what rules are there that help people build relationships, because I felt that that was what's needed.
Well, thank you. I would just point out that Ostrom developed those 8 principles from working with communities, right? It wasn't like some Western that she came up with. She developed it with the communities. I don't know if anyone else has.
She was a good social scientist. She looked at communities that work and looked at what they shared and then proposed a set of hypotheses, which then turned out to be pretty well confirmed.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I had a question. How do you deal with cooperation? Like when, say, someone sticks their feet in the ground, they don't want to move. How do you facilitate cooperation and consensus when people are being stubborn?
I think that the power of the group can be mobilized against the stubborn folks. The stubborn folks either have to get along with the group or leave. And so I think stubbornness has to be dealt with by a group process. And it's difficult. So I agree that the whole business of creating strong relationships is not at all easy. And that's why I cite people like the Harvard Negotiation Project, who spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get people to build relationships while they negotiate. So they have many books, and one of the main things is recognize the emotional viewpoint of the people that are being stubborn. They're being stubborn, focus on why they feel, are they being stubborn because they're not being listened to? Or what is it that's making them so stubborn? And what's the emotional basis for that? And address that to get them to be less stubborn.
Go ahead.
I wanted to make a comment and see if you agree, but I think there's a lot of confusion because common pool resources are conflated with commons, or open regimes like the digital situation mentioned a moment ago are conflated with commons, or simple people having relationships are said, oh, well, that's a commons. I think there's a shared commitment of purpose or commitment pooling that really needs to happen for people to develop the attributes of a commons and get out of their individual mentality, mindset. And I would like to get your comments on that idea, because I think there's a lot of confusion in the conflating of those different ideas.
I agree. And persuading the people that are insistent on individualism is a key part of it. When I was working with one of the committees I was on, we visited New Hampshire. And New Hampshire has on its license plates, it says, live free or die. And so we were in a meeting with some people from New Hampshire, and they were recognizing that they had a common problem there in their valley. And so I focused in the discussion. I said, well, why don't you focus on your common problem and how you can get together and solve it? And is your license plate part of your problem? Challenging the individualism that they were so devoted to, because when people have to live together, and in New Hampshire, they live in small communities, they have very successful small communities, and live free or die is not what they live by, but that's what's on their license plate. So they need to think about it.
Thank you so much. One last question.
Yeah, I thank you for the plate idea, because I was actually thinking about freedom in the context of relational in relationships and individualism. So I wonder what would be relational freedom, because we grow up a lot with the idea of individual freedom. We want to do what we want, and nobody should just tell us what we need to do. But so if we go into a context of relationship, what would freedom look like?
So I think successful indigenous communities, they respect the individuality and the livelihood of each individual. So each individual gets respect for what they're valuable as, but they have to respect, all individuals have to respect each other. So it's a rule. If you want to be free, if you want to be respected for who you are, you have to respect other people as well. And so and it's one of the interesting things about indigenous communities is they're very insistent that you respect the individualism and the value of each person, but you don't tell them what to do. And so, but they have a duty to participate in the community. And that's one of the big puzzles, I think, that folks have to work out. How can we respect the right of everybody to have a good life and not tell them what to do when, if they do something that impinges on other people's freedom, they have to stop. So I think it's incumbent on emphasizing this dilemma that if you want to be free, everybody else has to respect your right to be an individual. And that is a constraint on their own individualism. They have to be respectful of other people. So if you're going to be a member of a community, you have to respect them and expect to be respected in return. And it's when people, and this is one of the questions, how do you figure out who actually belongs? Well, anyone who belongs who is willing to respect other people. And if you just insist that you have the right to do anything you want, well, how can you ask other people to help you?
Well, thank you so much. I think this discussion is a great gateway to thinking about alternatives beyond capitalism, because I think alternatives that have to reconcile that aspect of individual freedom and collective, respect for humans and the rest of nature. So without saying anything else, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, just thank you so much for your comments and for being here today. And thanks for everyone for participating. And got some music in the other room starting. Thank you. And
so thank you so much, Dr. Trosper. We'll definitely try to have you back.
Well, I'm glad that we had this brief time and we managed to deal with the distances involved.
Take care.
Thank you so much.